Order. Questions to the Prime Minister. Nick Dakin.
Question number 1, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This morning I had meetings with ministerial colleagues and others, and in addition to my duties in this House, I shall have further such meetings later today.
Nick Dakin.
People using Scunthorpe General Hospital today are asking for reassurance. Given Sir Bruce Keogh says now is not the time for hasty reactions or recriminations, will the Prime Minister commit the resource and support, as well as the challenge, to ensure that the Scunthorpe Hospital delivers high-quality care across all its departments?
Prime Minister.
Well, first of all, let me echo what he said about the Keogh report. It is a good report, and it says that even those hospitals that face these challenges that have been investigated have many instances of excellent care. In terms of resources, this government is putting the money in, £12.7 billion extra over this Parliament, and we're also going to help those hospitals that are challenged to make sure they provide the very best they can in our NHS.
Mr. Richard Harrington.
Mr. Speaker, I'm sure you'll be delighted, as I am, that unemployment in Watford has fallen once again to the lowest level since the end of 2009. I hope that the Prime Minister would agree with me that this is a good example of government policies to small businesses working, because they are the ones that are providing the 1,000 jobs and apprentices that were shown at the Watford Jobs Fair 2 weeks ago.
Prime Minister.
Well, my honourable friend is absolutely right. The unemployment figures today are welcome. They see a very large fall in the claimant count today 20,000 in the last month, and they see encouraging signs in terms of employment growth, and some of that is because of the extra resources that we put into apprenticeships. Over 1 million people starting apprenticeships in this Parliament, which we can be proud of, and I hope the fall in unemployment will be welcomed across the House.
Mr. Ed Miliband.
Mr. Speaker, the vast majority of doctors and nurses working in the NHS perform to a very high standard day in, day out. But everybody in the country will be concerned that some hospitals are letting people down. So Bruce Keogh's excellent and important report found, and I quote, frequent examples of inadequate numbers of nursing staff. Will the Prime Minister tell the House what he's doing to ensure adequate numbers of nurses in the health service?
Well, first of all, let me agree with him that the Keogh report is an excellent report, and it's right. When you have a problem of high mortality rates relatively in some hospitals, it is right to hold an investigation, get to the truth, and then take action to deal with that. Now, he asks what measures we will take. First of all, we're putting £12.7 billion into the NHS, and we have, over the course of the last year, seen an extra 900 nurses in our NHS. That backs up the 8,500 extra clinical staff since this government came to office.
But Mr. Speaker, the reality is that there are 4,000 fewer nurses than when the Prime Minister came to power. And one of the issues raised in Sir Bruce's report was about nursing staff. It was also reflected in the Francis report about benchmarks for the numbers of nursing staff. Given that there are over 4,000 fewer nurses, can the Prime Minister say how that is whether that is helping or hindering sorting out these problems?
He makes a link between the 11 hospitals that have been put into special measures and nursing numbers, and he might actually be interested in the figures, because 8 of the 11 hospitals identified of the 11 actually have more nurses today than they had in 2010. If, for instance, if you take the hospital in Scunthorpe, that was just mentioned, although that's on the list of the 11 hospitals, there are actually 100 extra nurses working there than there were 3 years ago. When it comes to clinical staff, actually 10 of the 11 hospitals have higher numbers of clinical staff. On the issue of the Francis report, Francis did not support mandatory nursing numbers, but let me say this, all well-run hospitals will have the right number of nurses and doctors and care assistants, and one of the purposes of these reports is to make sure that hospitals are better run.
Miliband.
But the reality is, Mr. Speaker, that his reforms are diverting money from patient care, and across the health service, the number of nurses is falling. Now let me turn to one of the biggest health problems the country faces, which is around deaths from cancer. The government planned legislation on plain cigarette packaging, but changed its view after he hired Linton Crosby, who also happens to work for Big Tobacco in the shape of Philip Morris. Are we really supposed to believe that's a coincidence?
Well, first of all, it's clear he doesn't want to have a proper conversation about the health service, and he hadn't done his homework on nursing numbers. Now, he asks about plain packaging on cigarettes. Let me be absolutely clear about this. The decision not to go ahead for the time being is a decision made by me and the Health Secretary. If you don't agree with that decision, then you can attack me for making it. But funnily enough, it is the same decision that the last government made, and I've got here the letter that the former Health Secretary of State wrote to a minister explaining why he wasn't going ahead. And he said this letter to the Honourable Member for Dulwich, and he said this: no studies have shown that introducing plain packaging of tobacco would cut the number of young people smoking, and given the impact the plan would have, we'd need strong and convincing evidence to go ahead. And he hasn't got ahead. So let me summarise. If the right honourable gentleman's attack on me is that we're not doing something he decided not to do, I'd suggest a different line of questioning.
Once again, the Prime Minister doesn't know his facts, because in February 2010, my honourable friend, in his tobacco strategy, set out quite clearly that he was in favour of having plain cigarette packaging. And that quote is from earlier. And here's the difference, Mr. Speaker. My right honourable friend moved to that position in February 2010. He used to be in favour of plain cigarette packaging, and then he changed his mind. So can he now answer the question? Can he now answer the question that he hasn't answered for weeks? Has he ever had a conversation with Linton Crosby about plain cigarette packaging?
I've answered the question. He's never lobbied me on anything. But if he wants a lobbying scandal, why doesn't he try the fact that the trade unions buy his policies, buy his candidates? They even bought and paid for his leadership. That's a scandal, and he should do something about it.
The whole of the country will have heard it's those same weasel words he's sticking to. He can't deny that he had a conversation with Linton Crosby about this issue. Even by the standards of this Prime Minister, this is a disgraceful episode. His own honourable member for Totnes, described it as a day of shame for this government. Mr. Speaker, he is the Prime Minister for Benson and hedge funds, and he knows it. Can't he see? There is a devastating conflict of interest between having your key advisor raking it in from Big Tobacco and then advising you not to go ahead with plain packaging.
All this on a day when this government is doing something they never did for 13 years, and that is publishing a lobbying bill. And let us remember why we need a lobbying bill. We had former Labour ministers who described themselves as cabs for hire. We had cabinet ministers giving passports for favours. We had a Prime Minister questioned by the police under cash for honours. They are under no position to lecture anyone on standards in public life. But isn't it remarkable, on the day of a massive fall in the claimant count, a fall in unemployment, a rise in employment, he's got nothing to say? And isn't this the reason? Last year he said this: next year unemployment will get worse, not better, under his policies. Nothing he said can deny that. Isn't it time to withdraw it and admit you were wrong?
The reality that he cannot admit is against the advice of every major public health organisation. He has caved in to Big Tobacco. That is the reality about this Prime Minister, and he knows it. It's Andy Coulson all over again. He's a Prime Minister who doesn't think the rules apply to him. Dinners for donors, Andy Coulson, and now Big Tobacco in Downing Street. He always stands up for the wrong people.
The reason his leadership is in crisis is he can't talk about the big issues. We are getting to the end of a political session when the deficit is down, unemployment is falling, crime is down, welfare is capped, Abu Qatada is back in Jordan. Every day this country is getting stronger, and every day he's getting weaker.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I know the Prime Minister will want to thank all those fantastic NHS staff who are rolling up their sleeves and doing everything they can to reduce avoidable early deaths. They're asking the Prime Minister for minimum unit pricing in order to help them do their job and stop people falling into addiction in the first place. Minimum pricing is sitting nervously on death row. Will the Prime Minister give it a reprieve, at least until we know the outcome from the Sheffield report and the Scottish courts?
Well, the step we can. First of all, let me say, I think the Honourable Lady fights a strong and noble campaign on this issue that she cares a huge amount about, and I respect for that. What we are able to do is introduce something that the last...
Order! The question has been asked. Let's hear the answer. The Prime Minister.
What we will be able to introduce is something the last government never did, which is to say it should be illegal to sell alcohol below the price of duty plus VAT. That is something, in all the binge drinking problems we had under Labour, they never managed to do.
Wayne David.
What's Linton Crosby's
Thank you,
view on
Mr.
that?
Speaker. In February, I asked the Prime Minister if he thought it was fair that Mr and Mrs Goodwin, both of whom are registered as blind, should pay the bedroom tax. He promised to look into the case. Mr and Mrs Goodwin's family voted for Prime Minister, but didn't receive a reply. Why doesn't the Prime Minister keep his word?
Well, I would look urgently at this case because I do reply. I reply to honourable members' correspondence right across the House, and I always will. What I would say, in terms of the spare room subsidy, we put in place very fair rules where it doesn't affect pensioners and it doesn't affect people who need to have that spare room. But perhaps when I do write back, there is one question I won't be able to answer, which is we still don't know whether the party opposite are going to replace this, because they won't give us an answer.
Mr. Graham Stewart.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This summer, when Labour members are in Blackpool on their Unite beach towels, can the Prime Minister assure me that his government, free both from weak leadership and from Len McCluskey, will not put into law the welfare benefits as a human right?
My honourable friend makes a good point, because last week there was a rare piece of candour from the Labour Party. They now have a welfare reform they're in favour of. They want to make welfare a human right. Yeah. That is the policy of the Labour Party. They opposed the welfare cap, they opposed the reforms to housing benefit, they opposed getting the deficit down, and now they want to make it a human right to give people benefits.
Mr. Gregory Campbell.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Will the Prime Minister join? Will the Prime Minister...
Order. Let's have some order. Mr. Campbell must be heard.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Will the Prime Minister join with me in wishing a speedy recovery to the Right Honourable Member for North Belfast, Mr. Nigel Dodds, who was injured while seeking to resolve problems in his constituency during the recent unacceptable disturbances? Will he also join with many in Northern Ireland who want to see the initiative headed up by Dr. Richard Haas from the United States of America in the considerable effort and goodwill that will be required to resolve all of the outstanding parading issues which have been plagued by violent opposition for far too long?
I think everyone across the House would have been very concerned to hear the news about the honourable member being knocked unconscious at the protests that were taking place in his constituency. I know everyone wishes him well, and I gather he is now improving. We look forward to welcoming him back to this House. On the issue, I think it's very important that we see responsibility on all sides in Northern Ireland, and we do take steps, as he suggests, in terms of making sure that these marches can go ahead in a way that respects the fact that communities must be good neighbours to each other. That's what's required in Northern Ireland, and I know my right honourable friend, the Secretary of State, will help in any way she can.
Question 4, closed question, Mr Philip Hollowbone.
Number 4, sir.
Prime Minister.
Overall, over 4,500 foreign national offenders were removed from the UK in 2012, and the annual removal rate has remained broadly consistent since then. However, the number of foreign nationals in prison in England and Wales is still far too high, and while it is lower than at the election, we can do more. That is why the Justice Secretary is working to secure compulsory prisoner transfer agreements with those countries with the highest populations of foreign offenders. And the government will make it clear in the immigration bill this autumn that foreign national offenders will be deported except in exceptional circumstances, but I do think everyone in this House can celebrate the removal of one foreign prisoner, Mr Abu Qatada, who returned to Jordan, and let me congratulate the Home Secretary on her hard work.
Now that my right honourable friend and the Home Secretary have deported Abu Qatada, something the previous government completely failed to do, will he do all he can to send foreign nationals in prison in our country back to prison in their own country, thus saving British taxpayers hundreds of millions of pounds as a result?
Well, I absolutely agree with my honourable friend about this issue and the fact that it requires real drive from the centre of this government. That's why we've held a National Security Council meeting on this, why we're trying to sign compulsory prisoner transfer agreements with countries like Albania and Nigeria, and I make sure that all ministers raise these issues in all their meetings with other countries where there are foreign national prisoners to be returned to. And we shouldn't rule out any steps, including, in some cases, helping countries like Jamaica with their own prison regime so it's easier to return people. This is a major priority for the government, and I want us to do better.
Emma Reynolds.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. The Prime Minister claims that he did not know that Linton Crosby worked for Big Tobacco. Yet Crosby is at the heart of Tory party policy and strategy. Why is the Prime Minister developing a bad habit, perhaps an addictive one, of turning a blind eye as to who his advisers actually work for?
Let me explain to the honourable lady. The role of Linton Crosby is to advise me about how to defeat a divided and useless Labour Party. And I have to say, on the basis of today's evidence, I'm not sure he's really necessary.
Lynn Davis.
In my Welsh...
Order, we must hear the question from Mr Davis. Let's hear it.
In my Welsh constituency, Mr Speaker, patients have to wait 36 weeks for elective treatment, while in next door English constituency of Shropshire it's 18 weeks. Now, what lessons does the Prime Minister believe the government can learn from how the NHS has been managed in Wales over recent years?
Well, there's a very clear lesson, which is don't vote Labour, because you can see what's happening in Wales, where Labour are in control of the NHS. They've cut the budget by 8%, and as a result of that, you can now see that in Wales they haven't met a single waiting time target since 2009. Meanwhile, in England, we're increasing spending on the NHS. Now, the Shadow Chancellor keeps pointing at the Shadow Health Secretary. The fact is, the Shadow Health Secretary is the man who said it would be irresponsible to increase spending on the NHS. And I've got a summer tip for the leader of the Labour Party. If you want to do better, you need to move the two people next to you, and you need to do it fast.
Just as I said for Mr Davis, Mr Flynn should be heard with courtesy. Paul Flynn.
Will the Prime Minister study the precise meaning of the word question and the precise meaning of the word answer and the need for a link between the two? Following the record number of unanswered questions and the record number of pre-prepared party political jibes last week at question time. a demeaning spectacle that shames him and his office. Can he make a start by giving me an answer today to this question that is both relevant and courteous?
Well, I'm assuming that one was a bit complicated for a whip's handout question, so he probably did actually think of it himself. But actually, this government is far more transparent than any of its predecessors about the information we publish, the public spending data we give, far more transparent than the last government.
Ellis! Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm pleased to say that unemployment in Northampton North continues to go down. Does the Prime Minister agree with me that today's jobs figures prove that this government's economic policy has not led to, and I quote, the disappearance of 1 million jobs, which was a forecast made by the Leader of the Opposition?
I do think it is extraordinary. On the day of this fall in unemployment, the Leader of the Opposition had nothing to say about it. In fact, Mr. Speaker, I've done a bit of checking. He hasn't asked a full set of questions about the economy since February, because he knows that our policies are working, Britain's economy is mending, and yes, he's absolutely right. He's absolutely right. The forecast was made that we would not make up for the loss of public sector jobs with jobs in the private sector. I know they're shouting. They're shouting because they don't want to hear good news about falling unemployment. Well, people do want to know about more jobs, more businesses and our economy making progress.
There's too much shouting on both sides, not on one side of the House, but on both sides. That's the reality of the matter. Emma Llewellyn-Buck.
How many of the Conservative Party's millionaire donors asked the Prime Minister to cut the 50p top rate of tax?
That was definitely a whip's handout, no doubt about that one. Let me explain to the Honourable Lady an important distinction. Let me explain an important thing.
Let's calm down and hear the answer.
The top rate of tax under this government is higher in every year than in any year under the previous government. But let me explain this point. The way it works in her party is the trade unions give Labour money, and that buys the policies, it buys the candidates, it buys the MP, it even buys them the leader. I'm not surprised if they're worried about the product they ended up with.
Mr. David Burrow.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Enfield has had the early advantage of a welfare cap for the last 3 months. With Enfield's JSA claims falling at twice the rate of the rest of the country, and with youth unemployment at a lower level, at the lowest level since early 2009, can the Prime Minister ensure that where Enfield leads, the nation follows?
Certainly, I join him in paying tribute to people in Enfield who found work and found jobs. The welfare cap is not only right because it would be wrong for people out of work to be able to earn more than the typical family in work, but it's also been working because the figures are showing how many people, seeing a welfare cap coming down the road, are getting out there looking for work and finding jobs, and that is good news for them and good news for our economy.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Would Mr. Adrian Beecroft have been asked to provide a report for the government on employment regulation if he had not been a major donor to the Conservative Party?
Well, the honourable member speaks both as a member of Unite and someone who gets £6,000 in his constituency party. I think Adrian Beecroft's report was an excellent report in terms of encouraging enterprise, encouraging jobs, encouraging wealth creation. But let me just explain one more time. There is a big difference. If you are a trade union and you give money to the Labour Party, you can pick the candidates and vote for them. You can pick the leader and vote for him. You can pick the policies and vote for them. I was elected by a one-member, one-vote membership system. He was elected by a trade union stitch-up.
Mr. Andrew George.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Of course, any government should be able to introduce a reasonable cap on very high claims for taxpayer-funded benefits. But if we're all in it together, then why is the government resisting the introduction of a cap, sometimes hundreds of thousands of pounds, in some cases, individual cases, over £1 million of taxpayer-funded benefits to the very largest and wealthiest landowners in this country through the farm support system?
Well, this government has done a huge amount in terms of tax reform to make sure that people pay the taxes that they owe. And of course, we always look at the CAP and the Common Agricultural Policy to make sure that it's fair.
Sir George Howarth, donors.
Mr. Speaker, in order to save the Prime Minister a little bit of time, I was a member of the Unite Union since the age of 16 as an engineering apprentice, and I'm quite happy to debate who spent their youths more productively. Mr. Speaker, on the 26th of June, in response to a question from my honourable friend from Ealing North on Tory dinners for donors, the Prime Minister said he'd be happy to publish the Gold Report. Is the reason he hasn't done so because he's ashamed of the fact that his party has had more donors than a late-night kebab shop?
Mr. Speaker, it is that time of Prime Minister's questions when we ought to remember the donation of Mr. Mills, the man who gave 1.6 million to the Labour Party, who got advice about how to dodge his taxes. When we get an answer to when you're going to pay the money back, then I'll answer his question.
Gerald Gillan.
Mr. Speaker, while still hoping that the Prime Minister will agree with the CBI and me and withdraw support for HS2, he will remember last November giving me an undertaking that people who were disrupted by this project would be fairly and generously compensated. Is he aware that on Phase 1, HS2 Limited has not yet rerun the basic consultation on compensation, and on current plans isn't going to do so for 2 or 3 months? Will he please intervene, speed up this process before those constituents and other people whose lives are affected are totally ruined by this flawed project?
Prime Minister.
The honourable lady is absolutely right to raise this. We will be setting out further consultation later this year, as we previously announced. We are committed to a very generous and fair compensation scheme. Matters relating to compensation are very important, which is why we've got to consider them carefully and make sure we get the decisions right. But my right honourable friend, the Transport Secretary, will be very happy to meet with her and discuss her constituents' concerns.
Helen Goodman.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Prime Minister has certainly been helping Jersey-registered companies with their exports. Perhaps he could tell the House whether the reason he took Petrofac's Ayman Asfari with him to Kazakhstan was because he had donated £300,000 to the Tory party.
First of all, let us remember which government it was that's going to make sure Jersey, Guernsey, Isle of Man and all the others pay taxes properly. It was this one. But I will tell you very directly why I took Ayman Asfari to Kazakhstan, because Petrofac is a company that employs tens of thousands of people in this country. It is investing billions into the North Sea. It is a major British energy company, and I'm proud of the fact that we fly the flag for British energy companies. And so when I finish taking them to Kazakhstan, I'll be taking them to India, I'll be taking them to China, I'll be taking them to Malaysia. We're not embarrassed about business, industry, enterprise and jobs on this side of the House. We want more of them.
Sir Peter Tapsell.
During his friendly discussions with Chancellor Merkel, have you and he and she examined the evidence that it is the existence of the European single currency which is a major cause of the despair which is now sweeping across southern Europe and threatens the democracy of Portugal, Spain and Greece?
What I'd say to my right honourable friend is, when I meet with Chancellor Merkel, we often discuss the single currency. I think it's important that whatever one's personal views about the single currency, and I never want Britain to join it, we have to respect those countries that are in the single currency and want to make it work. I believe there's an opportunity for Britain, at the same time as doing that, to argue that the European Union itself needs to change. We need to make this organisation one that both members of the single currency can be comfortable in and members who are not in the single currency can be comfortable in. And I think Chancellor Merkel understands that. I also think that Prime Minister Letta from Italy, who I'll be meeting with straight after this session, I think he understands that point as well. And that's why I think it is achievable to get a better settlement for Britain, and one that we can get looked at in a referendum by the end of 2017.
We're grateful.
The Prime Minister failed to say last week when he's going to give back the stolen cash that Asil Nadir gave the Conservative Party. When is he going to give it back?
I have to say, the whip's handout has been very active this week. What we need to see is, when are we going to get the taxpayers' money given back from Mr. Mills's donation? Never mind a donation that happened 20 years ago. This happened about 20 weeks ago.
Dr. Matthew Offord.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. One of the first acts of this government was to agree a request to fund security measures in Jewish voluntary-aided, maintained and free schools. Parents in my constituency of Hendon, and indeed in my honourable friends from Finchley and Golders Green, were paying for these additional security measures to those found in other schools from their own pocket after the last government refused to help. As this funding arrangement ends in 2015, can I ask the Prime Minister to support my campaign for the Education Secretary to continue with this scheme?
Well, I will look very carefully at what my honourable friend says. I'm a strong supporter of free schools and also a strong supporter of the Community Security Trust that has provided a lot of security for schools, I think, in his constituency and neighbouring constituencies. My right honourable friend, the Education Secretary, will be very happy to look at this issue to see how we can continue to give them support.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Given the scandal of price fixing in the oil and gas industry that's currently being investigated by the European Union, does the Prime Minister agree with me that it's important to be absolutely transparent about the oil and gas companies that Linton Crosby's lobbying firm has represented?
Really, have they got nothing to say about unemployment, about improving education, about capping welfare? Let me, I mean, it pains me to point this out to the Honourable Lady, but she has received £32,000 from affiliated trade unions. Now, this is... let me explain the difference. With Linton Crosby, the Conservative Party gives him money to help us get rid of Labour, right? That's the way it works. With the Labour Party, the unions give you money. That's the way it works. And she said this. She said this on her website: I'm a member of Unison and Unite, and I regularly raise trade union issues in Parliament. They pay the money in, they get the results out. That's the scandal in British politics.
Mr. Speaker, many...
Order! Order! Mr. Hughes' question will be heard. Mr. Hughes.
Many water companies in England have paid huge dividends to their shareholders, have avoided paying tax, and are not properly accountable, and in this region are proposing an annual increase of £80 a year on water rates. Will the Prime Minister make sure that no public subsidy is given to Thames Water or any other water company which puts the profits and its shareholders ahead of the interests of ordinary ratepayers and the taxpayers of his constituency and mine?
Well, first of all, let me be clear. I've always said that companies should pay the tax that they owe. I don't want to comment on an individual company's business, but that is the case. Any support from government must be targeted to benefit customers' bills and to provide value for taxpayers. There is merit in the Thames Tunnel proposal. We need to look at that carefully, because it would be a benefit for London, for his constituents and for everyone living in London. But I can assure him we'll use every tool at our disposal to get the best deal for London, for bill payers and for taxpayers.
Green.
Did the Prime Minister ask Linton Crosby who his big business clients were before he employed him?
Minister.
Do you want? I mean, we can run through this one again. Let me have another go. Let me have another go at explaining. Right. It works like this. The Conservative Party gives Linton Crosby money, and he helps us attack the Labour Party, right? The trade unions give money to the Labour Party, the other way round. And for that, they buy your candidates, they buy your MPs, they buy your policies, they even give you this completely hopeless leader.
Last but not least, Mr. Andrew Griffiths.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My constituent, Kelly Bridget, was diagnosed with cervical cancer at the age of 25 when she had her first smear. Sadly, Kelly had to have a hysterectomy. Will the Prime Minister join me in congratulating Kelly on her Drop Your Pants and Save Your Life campaign to raise awareness of cervical cancer? And will the Prime Minister agree to talk to the Health Secretary about Kelly's wish to bring the age at which young women can have a smear down from 25 to 20?
Yes. Well, I pay tribute to my honourable friend and to his constituent for the bravery of raising this campaign and for speaking so frankly about it. The screening programmes we've had in the NHS under successive governments have been one of its greatest successes in terms of early diagnosis of cancer and saving lives. And we should always be asking what the latest evidence is for these screening programmes and when they should start. And I'm sure that my right honourable friend, the Health Secretary, will want to talk to him about this campaign.
Order.